Okay, get ready to dive deep, really deep into some fascinating stuff like a personal revelation of God, the one Moses experienced. We're looking at a Bible study lesson on Exodus, chapters 33.18 all the way to 37.16. It focuses on what happens right after that whole golden calf incident, a pretty big turning point for the Israelites.
Yeah, this deep dive, I think it's really interesting. It kind of shows how Moses' relationship with God changes. I mean, after the Israelites mess up so badly, you'd think there'd be distance, maybe even punishment, but no. Instead, they become even closer. And it starts with Moses uh, making a pretty bold request. He asks to see God's glory. It's called kavod in Hebrew.
Kavod. I'm not really familiar with that term. Like, what does it actually mean?
Oh, it's a super important concept. Kavod is basically like God revealing himself, but in a visible way. Like, think a consuming fire or a thick cloud. Really powerful images. Remember those big dramatic displays of God's power back at Mount Sinai?
Oh.
Yeah, those were kavod. But here, Moses isn't asking for another public show. He wants something much more personal.
So it's more like he wants to connect with God, deeper, more intimate, not just see his power, but experience his presence, like one-on-one.
You got it. And that's what makes this request so important. It's like a shift in Moses' spiritual journey. He's yearning for more than just the outward stuff.
Okay, so Moses asks to see God's kavod. What happens then?
Well, God answers him, but it's a mix of like grace and caution. He agrees to show Moses his goodness, but he also sets a boundary. Says, "No human can see my face and live." It's a powerful reminder, even in the midst of this closeness, there's got to be awe and reverence, God's full glory. It's just too overwhelming for us mortals to handle.
Yeah, I get that. It's like there's a limit to how much we, as humans, can actually understand about God. That sense of mystery, it's always there, even when he reveals himself.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But even though Moses can't see God's face directly, God does reveal certain attributes, specific qualities to him, like tenderness, compassion, being slow to anger, rich in love and faithfulness, forgiveness, but also, punishment.
That's interesting. God balances those things, mercy and justice together. It reminds me of us,
Yeah.
how we can love so deeply, but also we make mistakes.
It's such a profound insight into God's nature, right? It shows us that he's complex. And these specific attributes he shows to Moses, they become like hugely important in Jewish tradition. They're known as the 13 attributes of mercy.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that term before, but to be honest, I don't know much about it. Why are those attributes so important?
Well, they offer us a glimpse into God's heart, showing us his willingness to forgive and be compassionate even when we mess up. They're almost like a roadmap to understanding God's mercy. These attributes are recited in Jewish prayers, especially during holy days, times of fasting and repentance, like Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement.
So they're not just ideas, they're actually part of Jewish practice and belief. They use them to seek forgiveness and to get closer to God.
Exactly. And even if you aren't Jewish, these attributes, they still teach us something timeless about God. It speaks to everyone, that need for mercy and second chances.
It's a powerful message, especially hearing about it after that golden calf incident.
Hmm.
Even after such a, blatant act of disobedience, God still offers mercy and grace to the Israelites.
And that leads us right to the next big moment. The covenant is renewed. And this is where things get a bit stricter. God gives Moses new tablets with more laws for the Israelites to follow.
It's like a fresh start, but with some added rules and regulations this time.
Yeah, and these laws, they emphasize how important exclusivity is to God in this covenant. He's very specific about staying away from pagan worship, no intermarriage.
The way those commands are given, it's like God is setting some ground rules for a committed relationship.
That's a really good way to put it. Remember, the Israelites, they were surrounded by all these different cultures, different beliefs, different ways of life, and God was worried. He didn't want them to get pulled away, lose their identity as his chosen people. He wanted to protect that.
So these commands, even the ones that seem a bit harsh now, they were meant to protect the Israelites,
Yeah.
to keep their special bond with God strong.
You got it. It's all about maintaining that covenant, that connection, and resisting the temptations all around them. Imagine being surrounded by people who worship different gods, have totally different morals. It'd be easy to get caught up in that and lose your own faith.
Okay, that makes sense. So God shows his commitment to the Israelites, but he also sets boundaries to protect their relationship.
Exactly. And this whole idea of grace and boundaries, it's something we'll see throughout the rest of this deep dive. It's a big theme in the Bible, reflects how complicated our relationship with God can be.
And that's what makes these stories so relevant, even now, thousands of years later. They deal with things we all experience: wanting connection, struggling with temptation, needing forgiveness, and a fresh start.
Absolutely. These aren't just old stories, they're reflections on what it means to be human, what it means to have a relationship with God. And the next part of our deep dive, it focuses on one of the most visually striking moments in this section of Exodus, Moses' face. After he meets with God, it completely transforms. So the text describes Moses' face as radiant after seeing God. The Hebrew word is keren and can also be translated as horn.
Wait, horns? Like actual horns growing out of his head?
No, no, not quite like that.
Mm.
Some old art shows Moses with horns, but it's probably misunderstanding of the word. The study thinks it's more about a glowing light coming from his face, symbolizing God's glory. It might even be a little nod to the Karen of that golden calf, like contrasting the real image of God in Moses with the fake idol.
Okay, that makes way more sense. So if Moses is literally shining with God's glory, why does he start covering his face with a veil?
That's a really good question. The text doesn't really give us a clear answer, but there are a few ways to look at it. One idea is that the radiance, the glow, it faded over time. And Moses wore the veil to, hide that fading and maintain his authority. Think about it. If people saw his connection to God literally disappearing, it might have made them doubt him as a leader.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. It makes you think about how even the most powerful spiritual experiences, they don't last forever. Even Moses, after being with God, has to come back to normal life.
Exactly. And the veil, it reminds us that we can't always hold on to those peak moments. The challenge is to make those experiences part of our everyday lives. Let them change how we act, how we treat others.
This is also fascinating. And now we come to the building of the tabernacle.
Yeah, building the tabernacle, it shows how committed the Israelites were to God again. They were so excited about this project. They gave materials, offered their skills. They even gave too much at one point. It was a real group effort to make a place for God to dwell.
Wow, that's incredible. They were really dedicated. It shows how important the tabernacle was to them. What do you think made them want to give so much?
I think they really wanted to reconcile with God, reconnect with him.
Hmm.
After the golden calf mess, they needed to rebuild trust, show God how devoted they were. And the tabernacle, it became a real physical symbol of that commitment.
So it's more than just a building. It's a sign of their spiritual change, like a way to strengthen their covenant with God.
That's it. And the tabernacle, it's full of symbols. It represents God living among his people. Every detail has a deeper meaning. It's like a visual language of faith.
I've always been curious about the curtain separating the Holy of Holies from the rest of the tabernacle. It's described as being beautifully embroidered with pictures of cherubim.
Ugh, yeah, that curtain is so symbolic. I mean, practically, it stops people from entering the most sacred space where the Ark of the Covenant is kept.
Mm.
But it also symbolizes a spiritual barrier, like how humanity is separated from God because of sin. It's like those roped off areas you see in museums or important buildings, emphasizing the sacredness and authority of the place.
And didn't something happen to that curtain when Jesus died on the cross?
You're right. The Gospel of Matthew talks about how the curtain in the temple was ripped in half from top to bottom right when Jesus died. It's this powerful image of how Christ's sacrifice breaks down that wall between God and humans so we can come directly to him.
Wow, that gives me chills. It's like the veil is torn open, showing that anyone who believes can reach God now.
Exactly. And that event fulfills the symbolism of the tabernacle. It's like the old way is gone and a new covenant is here, one based on grace and coming to God directly through Christ.
So the tabernacle isn't just something from the past. It's like a prediction of God's plan for salvation through Jesus.
Exactly. It shows that God's plan continues through history, from the old covenant to the new.
Let's talk about some of the specific things inside the tabernacle, starting with the most important one, the Ark of the Covenant.
The ark is really the center of the tabernacle. It's a wooden chest covered in gold, and it holds the tablets with the Ten Commandments, represents God's law, his agreement with his people.
So it's not just a box. It's like a powerful symbol of God's presence and authority.
Absolutely. And it's also connected to God's kavod very directly. It was said to be present right on top of the ark, between the wings of two golden cherubim on the lid. Remember that visible glory we talked about earlier? Well, the ark is where it was strongest.
The lid of the Ark was called the mercy seat, right?
Hmm.
That name always stuck with me.
It's a powerful name. It points to God's true nature. On Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the high priest would sprinkle the blood of atonement on the mercy seat. Imagine that, standing before the ark, asking for God's forgiveness for the whole nation.
So the mercy seat is like the place where God's justice and mercy come together. where forgiveness and reconciliation happen.
Exactly. And there's that connection to the new covenant again. The mercy seat was where atonement happened in the old covenant. But now, Jesus Christ, through his sacrifice on the cross, he becomes the ultimate mercy seat for everyone. He takes our sin, offering us forgiveness and a way to come back to God.
It's amazing how these old covenant symbols are fulfilled in Christ, like a thread running through history, connecting the past and the present.
It really is a beautiful tapestry of foreshadowing and fulfillment woven throughout the scriptures. And speaking of threads, let's move on to another important piece in the tabernacle, the table of the bread of the presence.
All right, this table was on the north side of the holy place with 12 loaves of bread on it, representing the 12 tribes of Israel. It always seemed so simple, but also really profound.
It really is. The table of the bread of the presence, it represents how God constantly provides for his people. Those 12 loaves, always fresh, always there before the Lord, it symbolized a constant offering, a reminder of God's faithfulness. And it also points to the idea of communion, fellowship with God, sharing a meal with him.
And there's a new covenant connection here, too.
Ah, you know it.
Yeah.
The table of the bread of the presence foreshadows the Eucharist, communion and Christian worship. Just like the Israelites shared the bread offered to God, we, through the Eucharist, partake in the body and blood of Christ. We enter communion with him and with each other.
It's incredible how these everyday objects, like a table and bread, become so deeply spiritual when you look at them through faith.
That's the beauty of symbolism. It helps us understand deeper truths through physical things.
This deep dive has been so insightful. It's made me think differently about my own worship and how I can contribute more to my faith community.
That's what it's all about. Moving beyond just learning facts and actually applying them to our lives in real ways.
We've explored so much in this episode. Moses' personal encounter with God, the symbolism of the tabernacle, and how it all points to God's plan being fulfilled in Jesus Christ.
It's truly amazing how these ancient stories offer us timeless insights into God's nature and our connection with him. And this deep dive, it's just the beginning. There's so much more in the book of Exodus.
If this sparked your curiosity, I encourage you to read the entire passage or explore other resources about ancient Israelite religion.
And while you're exploring, think about this. How can you contribute to your own community, not just with material things, but with your time, your skills, or even just a simple thank you note?
Remember, every act of sincere devotion, no matter how small, is a valuable offering to God. Thanks for joining us in this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.
So we've talked about a lot in this deep dive, like Moses meeting with God, the symbolism of the tabernacle. But you mentioned something earlier about empty-handed worship. It really got me thinking. Yeah, that's something that comes up again and again in Exodus, this idea of not coming before God empty-handed. And I think it's super relevant to us even today.
You know, when I hear empty-handed worship, it makes me think of, like, those times you show up at a party and realize you forgot a gift. Awkward. Is it anything like that?
Haha. Well, there are some similarities. Back then, with the Old Covenant, it meant bringing actual offerings, along with the sacrifices everyone made together.
Right.
People would bring grain, produce, livestock, all kinds of stuff. It was a way to recognize God's provision, show their thanks.
So it's about, like, really taking part in the rituals. Not just being there, but actually contributing something.
Exactly. It showed how committed they were to God, and it helped support the temple and the priests.
But you said there's a deeper meaning to it, right? Something beyond just the physical stuff. What does empty-handed worship mean in a spiritual sense?
It means bringing everything we are to God. Not just our bodies, but our hearts, our minds, our whole selves. It's asking ourselves, what am I giving to my faith community? What gifts, talents, resources am I offering to God?
So it's not just about what we hold in our hands, but what's in our hearts.
Exactly. And it's not about comparing ourselves to others or feeling bad if we don't have a lot to give. Remember that story about the widow's mite?
Yeah, the widow who gave just a few pennies, but Jesus praised her generosity.
That's it. Jesus saw her heart. She was willing to give sacrificially, even though she had so little. That's what matters to God. The sincerity of our offering, not how big or expensive it is.
It reminds us that everyone has something to offer, no matter what our situation is.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that our contributions are valuable, even if they seem small, and knowing they can make a real difference in our community.
So how can we avoid empty-handed worship in our lives today?
It starts with thinking about it. Ask ourselves, what gifts has God given me? How can I use them to help others, to build up my community?
It could be our time, our talents, encouraging words, even just a kind act.
You got it. Any act of true devotion, no matter how small, it's precious to God.
This whole deep dive has been so insightful. It's made me really think about my own worship and how I can be more involved in my faith community.
And that's really the point. It's not just about learning things, it's about putting what we learn into practice,
Yep.
making it part of our lives.
We've covered so much today. Moses' personal experience with God, the meaning of the tabernacle, and how it all connects to Jesus.
It's amazing, isn't it, how these ancient stories still speak to us today. They teach us about God and our relationship with Him. And this deep dive, it's just a starting point. There's so much more to explore in the book of Exodus.
I encourage everyone listening to check out the whole passage or look into other resources about ancient Israelite religion. It's fascinating stuff.
And as you explore, think about this. How can you make a difference in your own community, not just with money, but with your time, your skills, or even just a simple thank you?
Remember, any act of true devotion, no matter how small, is a precious gift in God's eyes. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.